Should be good.
Think we're good.
I think we're good. We're always good, aren't we?
We're great.
We that's the thing is I think that we're both people that really like identifying with a solid good guy. Would you agree to that?
I think so. Like as compared to like an anti-hero,
As like
is
an
that?
anti-hero or like because like I like a good villain who
Hmm.
doesn't, but um, I'm I'm more impressed from like a writer or an actor or artist or whoever that can pull off a solid like good guy, as opposed because I feel like doing an anti-hero or like somebody like that, that's easy. No disparaging, people like Harrison Ford, who are good at playing those gruff characters, but it's easy to pull that off and have it be like, oh yeah, I like that guy. He can be an asshole, but he can also like save the day and be and do the right thing. And it's like, well, that's cake and eat it too for me.
Right, and usually where those anti-heroes shine are in supporting roles. When they in a lot of the stories that have the anti-hero in the main role, it tends to have that darker, grittier sort of feel. And where that can have an interesting story, a lot of times it'll fall into very familiar story beats and tropes. While with a good character, the hero, that's the one that I find value in is the protagonist that has to go through a hero's journey, and it's not a journey that comes easy, and it's because they take the hard road. It's because they choose to do the right thing, the harder thing. The harder right is better than the easier wrong. Sort of, not wanting to cut the
Right.
corner, and they can be flawed as well. And I think that can be a
Well,
really
of
good
course, yeah.
character. They don't have to be that perfect paragon of doing everything, and all too often that usually ends up the perfect person ends up actually being a twist to a villain later on, right? He's not actually the
Right.
paramour, he's the false idol. And
Right.
our hero tends to be usually from humbler beginnings, at least at first, and then
Right.
has to somehow come to reckon with who they truly want to be and how they want to affect the world, and what ethics and morals does she come with in that she has to um, you know shine and exude in the face of challenge or hardship. So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
I like the better the good character as well. Yeah, I'd say that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I mean, it's good that you brought up Hero's Journey, just because that that in and of itself could honestly be considered a trope and surprise everybody. We have to restart our trope conversation because I stopped recording halfway through ours original one, but that's fine because I can talk to Ken for endlessly for hours, and you're about to listen because this is not just fantasy. It is life in on an epic scale. That's what the hero's journey is. Is it's one of the reasons why I really connect with it and I really agree with it. Uh, is like Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey, the reason that it appears in so many different stories, so many cultures, and the reason that it keeps recurring in stories unconsciously is that they are like when you break down like all the details of a story, it's essentially like an internal journey of discovery, and it's the journey of the self that we all go through. We
Mm-hmm.
all start somewhere. We all have mentors. We all have parental figures that at some point we have to reject in some way, whether it's simply like I have to reject your home in order to find my own. You have to leave home, and then everybody goes through struggles of combating with different things and struggling. Everybody's had their moments, as he calls, in the belly of the beast, where you're at your lowest point. You could almost be devoured. But people who come through that are changed, and when you reach the the height of your life, which is, a lot of times it's like an internal discovery about something about yourself or even about the world, you tend to share that. And that's what where the hero's journey ends, is you come back home with the new wisdom, and whether people, and that's the thing, is when you go through life and you learn things, you tend to want to share them with people.
And you know, Dan, the hero's journey speaks a lot to story, to fiction, and like you said, to how it applies to real life, right? In our own ways, we all go through our own sort of journey, right? We all see the world in our own eyes and lens, as a protagonist of sorts.
Yes.
I would go on to say, and to tie back to our earlier conversation, and the topic on fantasy tropes, is the hero's journey comes up so frequently in so many different fantasy genres, fantasy stories, in all different mediums, whether it's movies, literature, games, anything. And the hero's journey comes up often, whether it ties in elements from other tropes we've discussed, with your forgotten hero, or the orphaned hero, or the silent protagonist,
Mm-hmm.
or the reluctant hero. But they all go through some sort of journey that they have to cross that threshold. And I'm curious, because I'm really interested in your thoughts. Is just why is that the case? Why does the hero's journey show up so often in fantasy?
And I think in fantasy, and I think also, because I think hero's journey shows up everywhere. It really, I honestly think you could take any story, whether it's, you know, a morose Coen Brothers film, or a George Lucas science fantasy, say, you're going to see it. And I think it's it's easier to see in fantasy, mostly because I just think it's easier to see. I guess that's my answer. It's easier to see in those things in fantasy, and I think that's because it more closely resembles the original form it had. The original form that we've seen in myths and legends. These classic figures like fuck, what's the name of it's the name of the it's like the famous centaur that Sagittarius is based off of, and taught like Jason, like he's like an archer.
Croesus. That's gonna bug me.
It's gonna bug me too, but like he's like a archetypical mentor. Jason's actually a very important prototype, especially in Western literature, of the hero, the classic hero, just because he has his origins, he has his training, he has to reject his source, and then he's put on a journey. And he's even like Chiron, yeah, and he even like has an Avengers style supergroup that he forms to go on a journey that includes like famous people like Hercules on it. But like that kind of story in fantasy, it's very easy just to see like, oh, they're like, because a lot of times it's mentors like, oh, the old man, the old woman, the old master of something,
Mm-hmm.
or sword master or whatever. And I just think it's easier to piece out, oh, like that's this part, that part, that part. And I don't personally, I don't have a problem with that until, just because that's the essential like structure. Those are the bones of a story, is this journey, because in classic stories, they are external stories with internal relationships. So like external action relates to something internal happening, like a character in the old days killing their father is the same as a person in their mind like, my father is not the end all be all of everything, and I have to reject them and move out on my own, say.
Right.
And I think when you open up, say something that's not fantasy fiction, but it's just say straight fiction. Let's say it's like a coming of age story. All these same things are happening. It's just they're most of the time much less dramatic, less external. A lot of times they're strictly internal journeys that people are going to, but it's still the same fundamental moments are happening. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think fantasy works and why fantasy connects to so many people and why fantasy films are popular worldwide. Like they sell really well across the world is because they are externalizations of internal truths. And
Right.
that's the fantastic thing about fantasy is that's what it does.
The world itself is a mode of escapism where
Mm-hmm.
you can visit a world apart from our Earth, whether it be a completely different world, a Middle Earth, or something that resembles something close to ours, or a galaxy far, far away, and it's a safe place to explore a lot of sort of inner truths. And so that hero's journey is something that we can internalize, and as we go through and observe the protagonist, we can see them go through their own trials. And while, yeah, we may not be clad in armor, fighting against dragons and Balrogs or whatever armies of orcs, we still have our own sort of challenges and demons to face and triumphs to have in our lives. And so you can draw those comparisons and metaphors. And I liked your answer in that, it's not that the hero's journey is more prevalent in fantasy. It's that it's just more obvious because you're right. It's something that is everywhere. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking back to all the different fantasy stories, and it's like, yeah, it's just very there. It's very in the front. It's very foreground,
Mm-hmm.
intentionally. It's
Yeah.
it's put there by the author so that we can latch onto that, and that's actually our anchor to a world that is fantastical, that has magic, that has a lot of other elements that don't relate to our world. So
Right.
what does relate? The inner turmoil, the strife, the inner monologue, the challenge that the heroes face. So I like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think really, and just going, because we're talking about tropes here, I think when that understructure fails the story is when I think, and I think it's a writer problem when the writer is doing they're doing it without realizing that, like, hey, this is supposed to have some sort of resonance to it, and they're just kind of doing it because, like, oh, I've seen that, but I'm not thinking about it, I'm just putting this in there, like. And it's kind of like I have this thing in my head or I've probably said out loud at different times, is when monsters are metaphors. That's why they exist, that's what they're for. But if a monster in a story is just a monster, it's just unfathomably uninteresting because it's so far removed. It's when you actually have some sort of reference point to it. But
We
on go ahead.
we see it in today's like films where there's some of the CGI renderings of monsters in either horror movies or fantasy movies. The CGI is like well and beyond what was done back in the early 2000s, and when the Lord of the Rings were done, or the earlier Harry Potter movies. But those monsters, if to your point, if they have nothing behind them that we can identify to fear or be threatened by, it can be the most gruesome, prettiest, or best looking piece of art, but in terms of a story piece, it's not something that we're going to remember. The Balrog is etched and scorched into my mind as something to fear because of a couple of things. The story had really good pacing and kind of building up to it, and then it really did symbolize sort of the fear of the unknown, of what lays deeper. It's that monster under the bed that you just don't know but you know have a sinking feeling is there, and that at
Yeah.
some point you'll have to confront, that Gandalf's gonna have to confront,
Yes.
with consequence. And where story writers fail at putting those monsters in is when they're, I would say, aping the
Yeah.
intent, trying to mimic. Like you said, they've seen it done before, so they're going to copy it because they know that it's a success. But they don't put the heart and that reason behind it, the reason to fear the monster,
Right.
or
Yeah. So,
and then for that you're just kind of like, okay, well, I've seen so many orcs before. There's no particular reason for me to be threatened by this one.
right. Exactly. Like, oh, I love a Balrog. I'm gonna put a Balrog in my story, but they're like, oh, it's just a monster, and the good guy just kills it or something or whatever, or fights it, and it's
Right.
like, it can look cool, and I'm not against things looking cool, but like, you know, there's a sense of dread and things like that. There's so much more to a monster when there's like when the metaphor for what it is conceived and put into it. Um, but yeah, I think that's true about all tropes. Tropes that are not seen or not used as what they are meant for, like representationally. I think that's when they're just kind of an empty like pastiche or like cut paste kind of thing. But like one thing that's, I guess, considered a trope that isn't that sort of thing, it is more related to setting, is medievalism. You know,
Right.
the trope that like, oh, you set it in a medievally Europe-y place, you know, with knights and castles and peasants and lords and all that stuff. And I like that stuff, but that's not a good enough reason to just use it or to have it be a well that people keep going back to. Because there's plenty of people who are like, I'm done with the medieval shit. I want to see something different. And that has given rise to the prevalence of what publishers like to call urban fantasy, which is basically stuff that's set in our world. It's just there's magic. Usually it's like a secret society or something. And I think I've said this before. I may even said it last time. I know I said it last time. It's boring looking. I don't like, and to me that, like, I don't want to escape, like, like just like think of it, conceptualize it this way. I don't want my escapism to move me from the chair I'm sitting in to the chair right next to it. Except that chair's got like a massage chair in it. You know, like I like massage chairs, but like that's not escaped enough. Like, and I think the one thing about medievalism that relates to something you said is it helps with the escapism. You're going into a different world that you can get lost in, you can have fun in, you could feel scared in, you can, you know, feel moved by, that's removed from our own. And then I think medievalism is an easy way to do that, is, oh, just set it in a form of a kind of remote antiquity.
It
And yeah.
it definitely has the benefits, and why it happens why I think it's happened in a lot of fantasy, that medievalism is a common trope. And I would say one of the most frequent sort of elements that happen in fantasy, right? Is that there is some sort of removal from the current world. And so if you're putting an adjacent setting to say to be in the medieval world, with knights and castles and horse is the main mode of transportation.
Right.
It's pre-industrial revolution, is a lot of the things that was the heart that Tolkien put in when he was creating the Lord of the Rings, which was, he was very much witnessing the Industrial Revolution in England and kind of the destruction of nature there that was going on as the textile industry was really picking up. And so, kind of harking back to a gilded golden age, almost lost, just on the cusp of memory, was kind of exploring, those folklores and fairy tales that he grew up with, and in kind of creating a world there, because it allowed for a couple of things. It was an escapism from the modern setting that he was observing, and
Right.
then also it was allowing for you know to be at a place that was accessible, that also was on the edge of, like, you don't know what's out in the woods.
Yeah.
So we were talking before about, like, like monsters are a common trope where the true heart of it is, if you don't understand it, or you don't see it, or if it's just kind of lurking on the edge of your periphery, it's a thing to fear, and that puts sort of the gut feeling in the pit of the protagonist's stomach. In the medieval world, it's very easy to imagine a bunch of monsters, because just outside of your small little enclave, your little fiefdom, is this, like, natural, ununderstood, misunderstood world,
Yes.
where in the trees there could be tree ents, there could be dwarves living in this mines, they could be elves hiding around in the woods, and they're not to be trusted, and that kind of creates sort of, you're already in a setting that really allows for that sort of wonder to occur. And so I
Right.
think that happens a lot in fantasy, because it's so readily latched onto, that even to today, when fantasy writers set in the medieval world, it's because we already have kind of a shorthand developed for that, as
Yeah.
this is a way to escape but not be completely removed, and still
Yes.
understand the fear of the unknown just outside. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I think a large part, yeah, is that it's easy to connect to because we all kind of have there's at least something familiar about it. So I think it's useful. Something to liven up. Fantasy fiction is, for me, is of course, like, I think remote. I always call it remote antiquity. You can call it medievalism, and I'm just like, I'm fine with that anywhere in the world. I
Mm-hmm.
want remote antiquity fantasy stories in Africa, in
Mm-hmm.
South America, and the North American continent, or in East Asia and South Asia, Pacific Islands. Like, I want all of it, because um, one, I do feel like there's a sense of danger, there's a sense of mystery, there's even a sense of wonder, because it's a world that I can't see now. It used to be here, but it's not.
Right.
And so I have an affection for that sort of thing, and but also I'm not opposed of, like, looking at those real historical places, but then just like, okay, but it's not that place. It's this fictional world. It's completely made up, which, because, like, I like that, but having the relatability of, like, oh, so it's like a medieval world, so it's like it's similar enough to something we can recognize, but also can still be it's completely alien, foreign place. Um, just because if you try to do that with a modern setting, it's like, okay, you now have to reinvent a vast amount of history and culture, because, like, that's when you get stuff like Bright,
And I was
which
just gonna ask if we could pivot back to urban fantasy, because you mentioned before, a lot of the world has to be sort of hidden away, right? In
yeah,
the Harry Potter, there's the platform. Was it 9 3/4?
9 3/4. Yeah.
And it's something that is kind of away from Muggle life, and so the only way to access it is to kind of step away from what we see every day. And what do? They go to a castle that is very much medieval in sort of setting and style.
Yeah.
So they go back to that remote antiquity style, even in an urban fantasy setting. Now
And I
that
think,
that Harry Potter's actually does it with some heart, I think, to help actually give that rooted anchor and away from it. To the counterpoint, what you said with, and I would agree, I believe, with Bright, it is just kind of slapping in. Here are fantasy elements that were used elsewhere. Copy paste, kind of cut it into here and put it in the urban setting. There's magic that's fantastical, but the whole time the story's struggling about what is something to be in wonder and awe about, and what is something that is, well,
Mundane.
this is mundane. There are orcs, there are elves, right? This is Los Angeles, and you're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be inspired by or not, and it's just kind of
Right.
there, and
Well,
that's where I think it falls down.
I think it also falls down because like there's something to be said about alternate history, alternative timeline stories. You can count like say Alan Moore's Watchmen as an example of that, or Man in the High Castle, or something like that, where but in both of those cases, where I think those are most for the most part successful, Watchmen to me definitely is. Um, it is a recent deviation in the timeline. So basically, history has progressed as is until you get to the 1930s, in both cases actually,
Mm.
and then that's when things fuck up, and that's where you get a different present or a different 1985 or whatever you want to call it. Like you get this different time, and the reason that works better than something like Bright is okay, all of human history is there. So all the like reference points that would exist in language and landmarks and discovery and science and all of that stuff is there. How like people diversify, if world events all exist up until that point, and then everything after that is different. It's easier to manage that than say with Bright, where it's like, okay, so apparently this is the world has always been like this. There's always been elves and orcs and magic and fairies and dragons, but it apparently had absolutely no effect on world history in terms of the development of technology, the establishment of varying countries, of language, of culture, of science, of anything. So it seems like, oh, so if we had elves and orcs, nothing. It's like it's assuming like nothing would be different in our history. Like there wouldn't be reference points, there wouldn't be wars, there wouldn't be like technology that we either would or wouldn't have based upon that. So it's an empty, I think somebody's called it like refrigerator magnet world building, where they just kind of
Right.
slap it on
Can,
this onto it.
can I I'm curious if it's only limited to like a live action format, or if it also would apply to animated. And I have an example, and I'm curious if you think it fits that description of refrigerator magnet world building, or has something deeper to it.
What's that?
Have you seen the movie Onward
Yes,
from Pixar? So
I would call
I,
it refrigerator magnet.
it's an animated
Honestly,
movie set
yeah,
in an urban fantasy style that has elements of magic and elements of obviously contemporary times. The guy's driving around in a van or the entire time, and
right,
they're in school and they're trying to chase after the MacGuffin to get their dad back because he's just a pair of pants. And so as they're doing that, they're kind of going through different elements of fantastical magic that has a lot of sort of the medieval motif to it, but it's
right.
of course set in a contemporary setting that just also happens to have magical creatures, and people just kind of don't bat their eye to it. I was kind of curious what your thoughts are, and whether that fits along the side of Bright that you were describing, or
It's
if it's something different.
I guess it's a little bit different. I maybe was too quick to just say it's another refrigerator magnet, but it's one of those things. I'm not against like something that we would consider fantastic being treated as mundane. I think most of the time when you use that, it works best as comedy. And like it should be used specifically for comedy, because if you just have amazing things as just normal and don't comment on it, but just because you don't bother with it, that's not interesting. It's that the kind of turning something fantastic into something mundane is comedy. It's like when, you know, like even something as every day you could say as say like somebody being pregnant, like when like somebody reveals like, oh, I'm pregnant, and they're like, oh, okay, cool, like, and they just ignore it, like that's it's yeah, so you're already laughing, it's comedy. So and that's a common thing, it still is considered, I'd say, fantastic.
Subverting expectations, I think, is
Exact.
what
Oh
some
boy.
comics call it.
Yes. Yes. My goodness. But no, like with Onward, I would honestly say that like the thing that I like, I guess it does establish that like, okay, magic used to be a thing, but now it's not, and it's one of those things where I'm like, so but we still like we still developed stuff that we have, like lawns and mailmen and cars, roads, airplanes, and it's just like, okay, so it wouldn't be any different at all, and it's one of those things where I feel like taking hardcore medieval fantasy stuff and putting in the modern world is very very hard, and there's a reason why it's not done often, and to me it's just because it doesn't ring true, because like the an example of to me how I think you could do it, and it's again it's going under the rule of secret.
Yep.
As long as because then the world can go on as is, but there's this secret under the surface truth world.
I would
It like
I would
like
I would sorry, go ahead.
okay. No, I was just gonna say like the way the Guillermo del Toro Hellboy movies have like this occult world of fairy folk and demons and witches and all this stuff exists in our world just under the surface, that like it's always been here, but we just as culturally have forgotten it or have had it hidden from us. And I think that works. And it's like I can imagine a story where like it's just like it's set in like a people live on a farm, it's modern day or whatever, but there's this one weird part of the woods they can't go in. And that's because that's where the elves are, the fairies are, so it's always been there. It's just hidden, which is how it is in our world. If you talk to people like in Iceland who still think of the of fair folk as present, and elves as present, they're like, yeah, they're here. They just they live in that rock. They live in that tree. They live, they're here. They don't live in this. They don't live where we can see them.
They're not just driving around the middle of the A18 in Los Angeles.
Right.
Right. I would agree there. I think as you were describing it, I think in contrast to Bright, Onward, what it does well, not only does it use it as comedy and doing it in a cartoon comedy, it kind of has that license. What it does is it does its elements of medievalism, as well as another common fantasy trope that we've been discussing, which is magic, is it kind of holds back on it. It really does a job about just kind of keeping it close and holding it close and saying, this is something that is kind of long lost and forgotten and is scarce. There's not a lot of it.
Right.
And in fact, like, it's a big deal that the dad was trying to figure out and wanted to be a wizard, and that the protagonist, when they're finding out that he can do magic, it was a big deal because it's not something that everyone does. And because it was kept scarce, I think that helped save it from falling into the vein of a refrigerator magnet, is because there was still something to be awed about. There's still a fantasy piece that allowed us to kind of look at, and as we're going through the emotional internal anchor of him trying to connect with his dad and finding out he had an older brother as a father figure, a very real life story. The magic and the mystery and the majesty of magic was still kind of preserved. It wasn't just wasted, and I think that's what really helps. That can help a lot in a fantasy story.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think, ultimately, I think you're right. I think that is a way that sets itself apart and is a better example of it. But on the topic of magic, I just think it's funny that magic is like, oh, that's a trope of fantasy, and I'm like, no, that's what defines fantasy.
It's like ingredient one.
it's
right on
ingredient
the
one.
package.
It's the essential ingredient in my opinion. That something
Yep.
isn't fantasy unless it has magic in it, of some kind, and the magic can either be like vague and very highly like just suggested, implied. It's where like somebody is like reading somebody's mind, or like cracking bones, and like I would consider. Even though it's very light on it and is meant to be seen as more historical or realistic, something like the 13th Warrior is made a fantasy story because we have an oracle, we have a seer in the very beginning who's the one who's like, we need 13 men to go and rescue this village, and I'm like, okay, it's magic of a kind, but magic is the key ingredient, so I can't call it a trope. What I can say is, like, magic of all kinds, I find interesting. Although, like when magic is too well defined, or okay, so actually, what's more interesting to talk about is I love that, like, and I mean it's something where it's like it makes sense in say the MCU, where they are so afraid of something being, say, as silly as just magic, that they have to make Thor and Doctor Strange like it's a kind of quantum physics science thing, like super, it's like, Thor's magic hammer is not magic anymore. It's now like it has a scientific source, and I think to me that helps make some fans of it calm. It's like, cool, it's not fantasy, it's science fiction, okay? Because I feel like there's like I don't know, there's a rejection of things being just magic. Like even a sorcerer in the MCU can't really be a sorcerer. It is all like this, again, like it's basically we prefer pseudoscience to just magic, because at least it feels grounded or something.
Right, they go to some lengths to try and explain how it could exist. Not how every single piece occurs, but how it
Right.
could exist. And they usually go on the vein of cosmic.
Mm-hmm.
Asgardians are, when they use God, it's the little g god, and all of the things and the powers they have are cosmic, to the point of, was it in Dark World? They have like floating skiff boats that are basically like spaceships, and so they're kind of
Oh
mixing
no,
in
yeah.
medieval elements with sci-fi elements to try and bridge this gap very steadily or
Mm-hmm.
carefully. And then with Doctor Strange, it's everything's coming from extra dimensional forces that they're tapping into some sort of energy source, and so
Yeah.
it's not necessarily just some simple magic. But I think, was it the ancient one? She goes and discusses how, like, you know, how you're physically fixing the body, and then that you can kind of tap into more of that, and that's what they do here, and that's I think how they try to tightrope walk to get a world that is, since Iron Man, very sci-fi based,
Yeah.
and try and introduce magical elements that they wanted to get to in their storytelling, because back in those comic days there were no limits. I mean, basically,
Yeah.
if it's there, they're going to write a story about it, because they're cranking out stories left and right, and they just have to think of what new storyline can they have their different
Right.
characters go through. And so you'll see in that gold, silver age of and even bronze age of comics, they were just cranking out characters and storylines left and right. So whether it was in space, whether it was grounded on Earth, or whether it was some sort of magical enchantress or anything like that, like they were going left and right.
So yeah,
So
it's anything.
fantasy tropes, of course, would be leaned into, and so you would
Right.
have characters in comics that would have medievalism aspects and
Right.
backgrounds from them. They'd be sorcerers, wizards, witches, and they'd go toe to toe, and then in crossover with other magical characters, and then in crossover events they have to somehow explain it, and so
With
now
with well,
now we're
with it
going
in
through that with MCU.
Well, with MCU, they feel like they like yeah they bake into it like oh it's not it's not magic, it's like extra dimensional stuff, which is a pseudo, which is I'm not say that's necessarily pseudoscience, but it's as it's explained in the movies is pseudoscience. And Thor, like it's advanced technology, you know, is his magic rainbow bridge and all that. It's just it's a way to like so yeah that when you see a man in a robot suit and a man with a magic hammer, it's not like that's you're mixing your magic with your fantasy. One case where that doesn't isn't fought by anybody is Star Wars. They do not. I mean, they do not make an attempt, at least in the original films, to give a scientific backbone to uh, the telekinetic wizards, and telekinetic wizards of the Jedi and the Force and all that. It's very mystical, and yet it's right next to laser guns and spaceships and all that stuff. And so like, and I just find that fascinating that like people then like no conflict whatsoever. Nobody and even after that nobody had a conflict. And then of course you have our man George Lucas being like, what if I give it a scientific basis and there's little bugs in us that give us the Force, and some people just have more bugs and so they can do it. And I'm sitting here hating that, but that's an example of like that's where it wasn't a problem. And even in the comics, they didn't feel the need to explain how's Doctor Strange working in the same universe as somebody like Daredevil or you know like the Hulk, you know, or all these very very much sci-fi characters, and it's like we don't have to. He does magic, they do science. It's like they can exist in the same universe. And I find it interesting.
It is interesting, and as you describe that, I'm thinking on 2 points because there's plenty to unpack there. You know, with regards to Star Wars and that acceptance, I think that comes to the classic Star Wars, Star Trek sort of conversation,
Right.
where in Star Trek it goes through lengths to try and explain a lot of the technology behind it, and even if there's something that can't be explained, because heck, we don't have teleporters right now or warp drives, but they go through lengths to actually sort of make it feel lived in, so that it truly is sci-fi by a lot of science fiction standards, right? The H.G. Wells sort of, hey, we're gonna try and actually pseudo explain how we get to where we're in this world.
Right.
Star Wars doesn't do that. Right out the bat, it's just, bam, you're there, flashing green lights of a one spaceship chasing down another, and then there's laser gun battles and space wizards shooting lightning.
Right.
And so, by that standard, it fits more of that fantasy setting as opposed to a stricter sci-fi. And so I think that's where the audience really does kind of set in and say, okay, well, this is in a different setting. It's not. It's got some medieval elements, but it's not a medieval Earth. It's a fantasy galaxy
it's a place,
far away.
It's remote. You put it somewhere else.
It is remote.
Whether it's yeah.
There is antiquity. I mean, heck, the entire Republic falling into the Empire is basically an allegory for the Roman Empire and how that fell. And then there are space wizards that are very much like the wizards of yore. And they're an ancient power that is held scarcely. There's not many around now, and it's not something that everybody can just do willy-nilly. So it is something that is kind of held back. So it fits all of those beats and lines. A lot of the comic storylines, when they were cranking out those, the fantasy ones would follow those beats and platform and elements. But then when they would go and mix it in with the others just kind of took off wherever they want, and so people just kind of accepted it. There was an extreme suspension of disbelief. If you want to truly see what Thor is in a non like reading set, I would say go to like Spider-Man and the Amazing Friends when he's a guest star, And like there's an episode there in that old TV series from the 70s where like there is a literal rainbow bridge, and it's Thor with like the helmet, Adventures in Babysitting helmet, and it's like,
Yep.
he is basically the Norse god of thunder copied and pasted and thrown into the Marvel universe, and now he's talking to Spider-Man. Does it feel weird? Yes. Spider-Man mentions that in his own quippy way, but it's not just so while it is sort of juxtaposed, it's not something that like you immediately write off. The MCU is kind of going at great lengths to do the more sci-fi explanation.
Yeah.
They went through great lengths on doing that with the arc reactor, and for Tony Stark. And so as they were building the world off of Iron Man, they felt they needed to continue explaining things to get people on board with it. And so instead of introducing a rainbow bridge with a helmet wearing Thor, they decided for whatever reason that they want to try and still fit it within that mold, still have it sort of be
It's the Star Trek mold.
on model. To have it closer to a Star Trek as opposed to a Star Wars, and
Right, which is just interesting to me, just because
it is interesting. I don't mind it. I enjoy the MCU movies, but I do understand that it is different from the fantasy origins, and part of it for me is understanding that with the MCU, they have the toughest tightrope between creating a world that is internally consistent with what they're doing versus being true to the source material. Because if they were true to the source material, we're Rainbow Bridge City here. And that's not going to be internally consistent for Iron Man. And so...
and it's not also not going to...
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to read well for everybody. Not everybody's going to be on board for Rainbow Bridge. Like, I'm on board for Rainbow Bridge, but I'm aware that I'm an outlier there, I guess, when it comes to that. But I'm also, I'm a fan of making it more of a Star Trek than a Star Wars, but I think it's interesting because I think it's the mentality of, say, science fiction and fantasy is different when it comes to what I call the uncanny element.
Mm-hmm.
So, the uncanny element in science fiction is some sort of advanced technology, or various advanced technologies. So like, say for example, like a pinnacle, in my opinion, or a stately form of sci-fi is Blade Runner, and the important technology there is the replicant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, like they talk about like, how they learn and all that stuff. Like, all that stuff's broken down because it's important to the plot, because science fiction is about, like explaining how things work. Because knowing that like just saying, oh, it just works and accept it, doesn't work for science fiction. You can't just do that, because it needs to feel like you can figure out how we got here. And in fact, that's usually where science fiction shines, is exploring like, how do we get here. A movie like Ex Machina is, it's like, it's about the process of like, okay, how does something become more human than us, and like but yet stronger and all that stuff. And so that's what science fiction is about. With fantasy, its uncanny element, magic, is both a storytelling tool as well as representative of a variety of things. It could be a representation, an externalization of wisdom, an externalization of power, an externalization of like the ego of a character. It's an externalization of and a manifestation of character and plot concepts. And so explaining how that works is not important. It's so like I think that's the mentality there, and at least with the original Star Wars films, like the Force, like really explaining it is not important. The important element is like it's here, and like how does that inform the character, like how does that affect Luke, because that's who we are in the story. And so like and seeing like, oh, it's basically, if the Force is the magic, and in Star Wars it's a representation of, basically like the power to do good or the power to do evil, that's in everyone, and
Right.
that the will to do it one way or the other is
Right.
is is where it comes in. And so I think that's really it, which is also comes into another trope, which is black and white, right?
Uh, can I make one final sort of
Of
cap off
course.
on the magic piece? Because I
Yeah.
do think black and white is a definite piece element into fantasy, and I know we talk on tropes. You know, I think as we mentioned at the top of the first conversation, a trope isn't necessarily meant as a pejorative, right? It's just something that
Right.
has a recurring theme, and
Yes.
magic is a recurring theme, that essential element. In Star Wars, the magic is the Force. Um, that Force isn't explained. You're absolutely right. I agree with you. In Empire Strikes Back, the most explanation of the Force is the training montage on Dagobah with Luke training with Yoda. And do we see the nuts and bolts of him learning how to do the Force? And is it really crucial about how he's lifting up rocks, or picking up boxes, or doing somersaults now, or Yoda picking up the X-wing? It's not. It's not explained, and so
It's
it
willpower.
it's because the story isn't about breaking down what the Force is and explaining it. The story is about Luke's journey. Luke is advancing and he is growing from one point to another in the story, and his training in the Force is that part of the journey.
It's the externalization of his growth.
Is the externalization of his growth. So, like in Blade Runner, you're really deep diving down into what is the element of the story. Is this unexplained piece, the technology, that's sort of the heart of the morality story of like, are they people or not? Do they dream?
Yes.
Do electric sheep dream? That's the part with Blade Runner. Back in Star Wars, it's not, does this force element pieces, does that really make whether somebody is good or bad or strong or weak? No, it really, if there's ever any like challenge that comes to Luke in Star Wars, it's never a matter of like scientific value weighing in on his force sensitivity to others. In fact, at the very end in Return of the Jedi, it's more of a matter of courage. It's not about him flipping and throwing lightsabers and force lightning better and faster than the others. It's him as a character reaching a journey point where he has, you know, showing courage by not fighting and not giving in to the hate and anger. And
Mm-hmm.
so magic is just there, it is accepted, but it's not something that has to really be devolved and digested and deconstructed to really function in the story. It's just there as a fantastical element to support us going through Luke's journey. And
Right.
that's where I absolutely 100% will say Star Wars is a fantasy story,
Mm-hmm.
and the Force is magic, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be explained, and it's better off not. We can leave midichlorians aside.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that's the problem. I think George just completely forgot that he that Star Wars was a fantasy series rather than a science fiction series. Because that's as the not to go on a tangent, but the prequels read more as science is like fantasy masquerading as science fiction. It's trying to be more. It's I don't know. It's just they're bad. I hate them. Anyway, um, so yeah,
Black and white.
just black and white. Yeah, yeah. So um, that's something that you could say is an easily thrown out accusation at fantasy or fantasy writers, fantasy stories, is that like the morality in them is very black and white. The Dark Lord, obviously evil, no redeeming qualities whatsoever. You don't even know why they're evil; they just are. And then the good guys, the white hats, they're just good, and you're just fighting evil. And yes, I can understand that that's thrown out there, and I can understand why. And I agree, it's boring. It can be like there's examples of it where it works for me. Like I feel like Lord of the Rings. Although I would say there is more nuance to that story than a lot of people will give it credit for. Because, I mean, you go. Frodo goes on this long ass journey. He's about to drop the fucking thing in the volcano, and then he's like, "Nope, this ring is mine." And it takes like this very complex character of Gollum, biting off his fucking finger to get the ring back, for that ring to be destroyed, and even people like Sam, who are like, pure of heart, like, can be disheartened, and can be, can let his despondency and his sadness of rejection, lead him to abandon, his friend and stuff like that. And you have Boromir again. So now I'm making the argument that there's a lot more gray to Lord of the Rings than I think people give it credit for. The main conflict, though, is not. Main conflict is very black and white.
Can I expand on that? Because
Sure.
I agree. But I think I have a perception on why it's done so often in fantasy. But I would agree
Please.
that the black and white sort of good versus evil being a stark contrast and pretty apparent in fantasy is an often done trope. And when done lazily as a refrigerator magnet story, it shows and it's obvious because there are a dime a dozen and everyone sees it. That doesn't mean that black and white, though, is just inherently bad.
Right.
It does make the story simpler, right? If we have to boil down and create a one-sentence story of what it is for Lord of the Rings, a halfling, a hobbit has to take a magic ring of evil and destroy it before the Dark Lord kills everyone, conquers everyone.
Takes over the world. He takes over the world.
And we just leave it there.
Yeah.
And so we have our protagonist, Sam, and Frodo and everybody else. And we have our antagonist, Sauron, and all of his...
Sauron.
Sauron is the Staron.
He's Sauron.
And his coalition. And it's really just that sort of conflict. Now, what I think that helps to do is I think it helps as a shorthand is it helps the reader know exactly what in this world is the main objective that we're doing here.
Yeah.
And it allows to explore, I think, the faults within our heroes, because a lot of times in most times that we live in our days and lives, we all see ourselves as the protagonist, but everybody does. So there has to be times when we're right, we're wrong, and we're not really sure which way we need to go. And so we live in a world of gray. So as we're escaping into this fantasy, we see stark black and white, and then we can kind of indulge in what the gray is, while still being in the safety that there's an ultimate quest here to defeat evil. So we're still on the path to defeat evil, but on the way we can indulge and explore the flaws and the faults of our heroes as they struggle with the challenge, and they struggle and kind of dip into that gray. Boromir, right?
Yeah.
Boromir is, I would say, he is a hero. Is he perfect? No, of course. He falls prey to the
ring.
The ring, and he has faults and stumbles, but at the end, he wanted to do good, and Frodo stumbled, and many others each of them would stumble in their own ways throughout, and except for Sam.
He has his moment.
He has his moment. He gets angry at Gollum, and he also has despair and just kind of leaves Frodo. But it does give for moments for them to then triumph over their own micro challenges there when they come back and they succeed. Yeah. And it's in that safety of, we know what the overarching story is to get to Sauron, the big bad, the BBEG, the big bad evil guy.
Yeah.
While the good is kind of traversing through the muck of the gray, to
Right.
get there. And I
I,
think
and
that I think that's why it happens in fantasy a lot.
and I think that's when it works
Yeah.
is when you can do like black and white, where, and I think you're right, it's the shorthand where it's like, okay, we know the trajectory the story needs to go for them to succeed, and we know this, we know the stakes. It's easier when like, okay, complete annihilation is what we're looking at, like that's the big thing. But I think one of the issues you can have with there is where it's that kind of cut and paste, like, oh, I saw it in Lord of the Rings, I'm going to put it in here, and so I'm going to have my good guys wipe out, tons of cannon fodder bad guys in this big battle to defeat this person who's nebulously evil. I I think I can enjoy stuff that's the black and white evil thing, like, but I think I connect to it more when I can understand what the evil is and why it's evil. I think that's the important thing to me is like, weirdly enough, I like relatable evil. I like evil that, like, oh, they're doing this horrible thing to people, or this person's bad because they're a bad person. They do horrible things and they want to cause horrible things to happen to other people because they're selfish, because they're like, for a reason. Like that kind of thing I can connect to, and so then I'm pushing even harder for my heroes to win. Is because, like, oh man, this person's an asshole. Like, get him, kind of thing. Where, as opposed to, this thing's evil, stop it. And I'm like, yeah, I guess. Like, it can still be causing harm, and that's a good reason to stop something. But um, I think it can be just ever more strong when you are able to identify something evil about it, like a recognizable evil. Best example that I can give, and it's to this day still, I think, possibly my favorite villain in film period,
Mm-hmm.
is Captain Vidal from Pan's Labyrinth. And the reason that he is so, for anybody who hasn't seen it, he is a member of the
Franco.
Franco, yes, the Franco regime, and he is just this nasty piece of work. He's a real hard ass. He has, he's violent. He's brutal. Just cold. He has married the protagonist's mother and wants her to bear him a son specifically, and just is just horrible, like smashes a person's face in with a bottle of wine. Like, it's just brutal. But the thing, and this is a fantastical movie with like a faun and like a horrid ogre monster that eats children, and yet he's the most evil thing in this movie. And the reason that it works, and the reason that I say he's the most evil and the best villain, is because that's an evil that I can see in this world. And by this world, I mean my own world. Like, he is a authentic kind of person that could
Mm-hmm.
exist, and that makes him all the more threatening. So as much as, so it's like, I like escapism and fantasy, but if I can have something to connect to my own world, my own experience, it resonates with me even more. And he resonates as like, oh my god, like these, like he's like one of those power hungry fucks who will do anything, destroy anyone, and to get what they want. And so, like, seeing that, like, oh man, like, I'm more fearful when I watch him enter a room with people I like, you know and I want him taken out in the worst way. Like, I want my heroes to succeed against him, because, like, that's a recognizable evil, and I can see all the harm that he has and will do if he's not stopped.
Do,
And so, yeah.
for a fantasy story, do you think that the antagonist or the villain needs to be relatable?
I guess relatable maybe is not the clearest word I can use. Understandable.
Okay.
In a way, like not in a way where like, oh, I like, it's like I would call Victor Freeze, Mr. Freeze from Batman. He's relatable. That's why he's my favorite Batman villain. It's because I can connect like on an emotional level with them, and so I'm like, oh wow, I like, it's heartbreaking, and so I feel bad, but I also see like that it's causing harm, and so he should be stopped. With But with like a fantasy villain or stuff like that, it's not so much that I need to connect with them on like an emotional level, or it's like, oh, but it's like, oh wow, like I understand that kind of person. Like I can see that, like I think that's why the many of the villainous characters in Game of Thrones work, in my opinion. A character like Ramsay Bolton is a nasty piece of work, but psychologically he makes sense. And I think that's why he's such a strong character. And I think that's why Captain Vidal is a strong character. Psychologically, he is sound. And it's like he's not behaving in an erratic way. He's not just blindly evil for reasons. He's doing things calculatedly, and it's causing harm, and that's what's scary about it. Same with Ramsay Bolton. Same like other villainous characters that have a sound psychology, even if it's harmful or they're crazy. Like there's versions of the Joker that is psychologically okay. That's a believable kind of crazy. And then there's the kind that like, I have this giant violin, and I'm throwing pies.
I want to poison all the fish in town.
So they look like me.
Which
is my favorite Joker story, actually.
It's one of the greatest ones.
Yeah, the laughing fish is perfect. But we're not talking about Batman.
Can we talk about Batman? I've been dying to talk about Batman.
Only if it's related to fantasy.
So I'm glad you brought up Mr. Freeze, because as I was looking and taking an inventory of various fantasy tropes, one of them that came across in my research was summon an evil entity to make a contract. And that's essentially where the villain, the big bad evil, they seek more power. And so to do that, they somehow create some sort of Faustian pact to get something, to get more power. And so it's supposed to embody everybody's greed or ambition to get and want more, but at some cost. So your Captain Vidal scenario, the Victor Freeze scenario, which is it's not just a villain that already has everything, and once it has everything they want and they're just out to try and conquer the world for reasons. It's they've made some sort of exchange to then sort of put themselves in a position of power that puts them in direct conflict with our protagonist and our heroes. Or if the heroes are unknown at that point, the established sort of order of that fantasy world, to try and take down Gondor and Rohan in the meantime. And so that's that sort of Faustian pact. And so in Lord of the Rings, Saruman would be that Faustian pact.
Faustian character. Yeah.
That goes and kind of sells his soul to the devil, to Sauron, for his own greed and ambition.
Right.
And so I think that's where you can do really well in a fantasy story where there is clear black and white, and so the evil is there and apparent. But how does the reader sort of understand, I think is your word, not relate, but understand them, is just kind of being able to understand what drives and motivates them to sign up with that big evil force to begin with. Right. What would even consign somebody of sound psychological reasoning to even consider that? And usually it's greed, usually it's ambition, but there can be other components as well.
Right.
Like Mr. Freeze.
Right, but also there's the graying of things, which I think is an interesting element. And so, like, an example of, say, graying things is like, what if, this is a big what if, in Lord of the Rings, we had, in one of, like, Book of Lost Tales or something like that, we got a passage where it's a representative of Sauron talking to the orcs to get them on his side, and the thing he's selling is, you're mistreated, you're attacked, you're forced out of any lands that the humans and elves are in. If you join with us, you will have your own lands. You'll be able to get revenge on these men who have done evil to you, and so then that makes the narrative of the orcs completely different, where it's like they're fighting almost for their freedom, or for their right to exist, or to have their own place in the world. And so that complicates the narrative, that grays it up, and makes it like, ooh, like, I want my humans to survive, but also, like, these orcs are just fighting for their own right to live, and because they haven't been treated well, and like, oh, so now that gives that tug and pull that you would see in a real world conflict, where, like, it's like wars aren't fought with good and evil except for in World War II. Like, there was, like, that's the only example you could really give. I mean, I guess it's maybe Civil War, but it's you gray it up, and
Right.
you make it emotionally and morally complex. That helps, to me, people even escaping into that world relate to it, because I'm somebody who, like, cannon fodder can be a fun concept to use, because it's just like, oh, I can show off how awesome this person is, and they're just like getting through all this, all these bad guys. But that doesn't stop me from thinking, what's this bad guy thinking? Like, right before he, gets his head cut off, or whatever. Like, why is he so intent on winning here?
2 weeks before retirement.
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
He's about to
Which is
get full
funny to me.
pension, and then bam, Luke
Right,
comes in and chops him off of Jabba's barge.
Right, exactly. So yeah, so that to me is an interesting angle, and I think that there's a way to balance those things. But, like, I don't know, I like that kind of emotional and, like, moral complexity, and, like, moral grayness. It's like, it's dirty. It's kind of like, you kind of have to wrestle and grapple with it. But I'm also not completely against black and white. Again, it's just how it's used. I think, again, with the overall, I think, lesson we have with this, whether it's, chosen ones and dark lords and medievalism and black and white, and even things like MacGuffins, magical items like magic rings and stuff, which
Yep.
you can get a chance to really talk too much, or quests as a thing, which quest, I don't see that as a fantasy trope. The quest is it's part of the hero's journey. It's everything. Every story is about a quest in some sense, and whether it's an inward quest or an outward one doesn't matter. It's just in how you use them, and don't be a copy paste dummy is really all I can say about it. Just don't do that, right? Like, think about it. Think about what, again, like you're saying, like, oh, the Balrog and Gandalf, that's a great scene, and that has, like, impact and force behind it, and there's something kind of just terrifying on a primordial level about this Balrog, because of where it is and how it's described and all that stuff. And then but then you take that badass Balrog and that badass wizard and you put them in, you just copy paste, but you don't have any of that, the impact. It's just like, oh, that's a cool looking monster and a cool hero and a cool fight, but then it's empty. And I feel like that's when people are like, fantasy's dumb and empty. And it's like, well, yeah, if you're only looking at that, at the copy of the copy of the copy, of course.
Right. You're I you know reflecting back, we've talked about a lot of different tropes, and they are recurring themes that are prevalent in, and not just wholly restricted to fantasy. It can be seen in a lot of
Right.
different fiction, but they're prevalent in a lot of fantasy stories, because at some point or another they have worked, and they have worked
There
when
we go.
they have been done so with the right heart and intent that allows two things. Externally, it allows the audience escapism, whether it's through remote medievalism, whether it's through a world of some sort of fantastical magic, or world, or sort of wish fulfillment of being that chosen one, or that
Mm-hmm.
that secret sort of prince or princess, or the last of a kind. It gives that wish fulfillment externally in a world that is safe to explore, sort of these sort of macro sort of challenges of how will good triumph over evil. While that is certainly evident in all fantasy stories, where it really lands true and does it well is when it finds the heart internally that somehow anchors the audience to believe in the hero. Whether it's, I believe that I can relate to them because they go through the same fall of flaws and faults and challenges as me, and they have to go through that same journey, that same hero's journey. And it's not always going to be pure black and white. They'll sometimes stumble in the gray. They'll sometimes say, no, I'm going to keep the ring for myself this one time. They're going to sometimes falter, but in the end, they show how they are going to grow and triumph. And it's not because we're going to meticulously explain the world as a means of how they're going to succeed. We were talking about breaking down magic and how magic is different from sci-fi, where the technology is usually explained to a degree.
Right.
And instead of us kind of focusing on that, we're more focused on, will this hero succeed? Will our protagonist move through this world, get to the other side on whatever their objective is, and will they do so successfully in a way that somehow takes us along with their journey to wherever they end up. We're there with them, and we say, you know what, that story was worthwhile to go on that adventure with. And I was awed and inspired by the various things that we saw along the way, whether it's a Balrog, a Treant, or Tauntaun, whatever it is. We're somehow inspired. And yes, Tauntauns inspired me. You can put that down.
There we go. Yeah. Entire inspiring tauntauns. Yeah, I think, yeah, ultimately, uh, tropes. Yeah, I think he really hit it on the head. It's something in the past, something that's worked, and works, and has worked many times, and will continue to work. Does it work every time? No. Does it work for everybody? No. There's some people, like just where we started this conversation, honestly, like with like Hero's Journey. There's people who I think you have to bury Hero's Journey deep. Like, I would say for some people so deep that the person writing it doesn't even know they're doing it. For them to be comfortable with a story because they don't feel like it's following that. Because there's some people I know that are just like, it goes through this. I think they mistake like a story you can follow as like a like boring, like predictable story, and it's like, well, no, like there's such thing as a boring predictable story, but like if you can tell where a story's going doesn't necessarily mean that it's boring predictable. It could just mean that it's being well told.
Right. Exactly.
Because we as people, we know how life is. We know how significant, when we see something significant and it takes us in a different direction and all that stuff. So it allows us to see that in a film or read it in a book or play it in a game, and it's like, oh, I bet I know where this is going. And it's like, yeah, you probably do, because like you've lived your life and done things, and you notice that like, hey, sometimes this happens, and then it leads you to the next thing and whatever. And so it's just how life is. And I think the mistake is thinking that like, oh, anytime you see a trope, anytime you see hero's journey, it means that they were lazy and it's bad. And it's like, no, it doesn't. It's not that at all. It's just it's an element. It's something that works and that resonates. It's really good.
Yep. If the story is predictable, it can still be enjoyed if it still follows a simple sort of framework. But then what I enjoy out of it is in the interactions in between. So, one fantasy story, Avatar: Last Airbender, that's a pretty straightforward story. Right out the gate, it's there's this avatar who has to master four elements and has to take down this fire lord and stop wars. Like episode 2, I think it's pretty much all set. Um, it's very simple, and if you've seen stories before, you're probably gonna be able to make some guesses about how the very end is going to show. But the journey along, it's very cliche to say, but the journey along the way is what's enjoyable. The interactions, the banter between the characters, who they get to meet along the way. One of the most enjoyable characters for me, like Toph, you don't get to meet her until much later into the story, and then once you have the core team together, their dialogue and interactions is great and believable, and you laugh at it, laugh with them as they get, and then this entire time you're marching towards the big bad evil guy, and you're like, oh crap, now I'm attached to these characters and I care about how and who's going to make it over to the other side and how they're going to get through it. And yeah, the complexity of the story never changed that entire length of that series, but the characters were an enjoyment to move along through the entire time. And I think that's where that would be the example I give as a counter example if someone says the story's too simple and so I'm bored. I'd be like, well, there are plenty of simple stories that are very enjoyable. And here's one, and there's plenty of others too. They have elements of all these fantasy tropes we spoke about. Aang is a chosen one, right? But that doesn't make it any less valuable of a story. It's told really well.
Yeah, no, and yeah, yeah, ultimately, like, done well, done poorly, all that stuff is very much for a single individual to determine. And something that works for me may not work for somebody else. Something that does not work for me at all can be the pinnacle of storytelling for somebody else. And so I think, yeah, whether it works or not is entirely based upon who's receiving it. And
very true.
But I just want people to like fantasy. That's all. I just want people to like fantasy. Which, it's funny. There's a question that I don't think I asked you last time, and if I did, you can correct me. What got you into fantasy? Could you pinpoint it? Or do you like know like when you did, maybe?
I'm trying to think back on it. I mean, growing up, I grew up in the early 90s when there was just a bunch of Saturday morning cartoons. And so you did have
Right.
things that did have fantasy elements and tropes to it that I was probably exposed to pretty early on. So that's like your Thundercats and your He-Man and all those sort of older late 80s early 90s cartoons that had a lot of the elements of fantasy into it. But that's sort of a second degree sort of exposure that I was getting. In terms of things that I really grasped me and I was just like really taken on, and I wanted to know more and more about, was that the original trilogy of Star Wars, and it's probably shown in that the fact that in this podcast I've spoken about it frequently. Was I wore those VHS tapes out, watching them over and over and
I'll
over
bet.
again, chewing on every piece, and kind of understand. It was before I even knew those elements that we just discussed today in the hero's journey and all of that. I didn't understand it, but I was enjoying it nonetheless. So that would be one
Right.
that definitely I would say brought me in towards fantasy. Playing the original Legends of Zelda on Nintendo. When we're talking about medievalism, very much a medievalism sort of setting with fantasy, and that would be another one that was a gateway or entry point to it for me. So yeah.
Right.
How about you? What were your introductions to fantasy?
Oh, I was telling a friend of mine before that I can pinpoint it as the medieval Legos.
Oh yeah. Okay.
The medieval, specifically the medieval knight, the armor and the little helmet that flipped up.
Yep. I know
And
exactly
the
what you're saying.
chest plate,
Yep.
the the broadsword, and they had like a little wizard and a dragon and the little like bow and arrow and the quiver and stuff like that. Like that was really where, if I could point to it, that's where it started, because I would just be playing with those for hours and hours, coming up with my own stories and adventures. And then it was just like movies and stuff that I watched, because since I had a bunch of older siblings, like I was watching shit like Legend,
Yep.
and
Good old Tom
stuff like
Cruise.
that, like where like that was foundational. Well, good old Tom Cruise. But like in things like Dragon Slayer and stuff. So like I was very much into it very early on, and and then just grew when like I read like Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe, and then later that year Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and like The Hobbit and stuff. So it's like that just kept it there.
Right.
And so yeah, it's always been there.
Right. Right.
Early on.
As you described that, yeah, it's kind of interesting because a lot of the things that, at least the mediums that I was first exposed to, I didn't get the first hand accounts. So like the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, until several years later in middle school, that I was like, oh, I'm reading this, and it's kind of, what is it, Seinfeld is isms, where you watch the show and you're like, oh, that's kind of a tired thing, a tired joke that's been done by sitcoms over and over, and you're like, yeah, but no one had done it before Seinfeld, and so watching it back now,
Right,
it
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
seems played out, but the first time it was fresh, and so it was kind of an inversion there, where I was experiencing like The Hobbit, and you're reading through it. I'm like, okay, I know what an orc and a goblin is by the time I was reading The Hobbit, through other exposures, but then D&D and things like that, and then you're like,
Right.
but wait a minute, back when this was first written, this is the book that all of those things were sourced out of. And
Right,
I'd have to
exactly.
I'd
Yeah.
have to say, even to a degree, like those medieval Legos. I love that you brought that up. I can vividly picture that exact set with the shields.
Yeah.
Right? They had the different
The
shields.
shields, those little shields. Yep, and because they had like those like the round shields, and they had the triangular shaped ones,
Right.
and they had the different clan symbols on their chests and on the shields and stuff, and little pennant flags, and lances, horses. Yeah, and yeah, you could build a castle, or whatever. Yeah, it was amazing. It was perfect. It was like, and this could be a topic for a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But I really loved him, especially because they didn't come with a story built in, except for medievalism of a kind of which is this nebulous, like it's a medieval story with knights and such. Go, and that was it. You could tell any kind of story you wanted with it, and the problem I'm not saying I'm lamenting the like the kind of Legos they have now. They're very much like, oh, it's specifically Star Wars or Marvel or whatever, where they have a story built into it. Because those are cool too, but they don't really do too many of the like open ended. Here are just archetypes. Make your own story, and one, I think that's because those are harder to sell nowadays. Because it's easier, so much more simple to sell a story people already know,
So
rather than to ask a kid, tell your own story.
So I know we're off topic, but in the vein of medievalism and in the in the vein of what you were describing, and I think that goes on to say sort of a creative thought and a creative spark is you were getting a creative spark from these Legos that didn't have a prearranged story, so you're free to create your own.
Right.
Today's Legos, aside from legitimate Legos, in video games, there's the sandbox game, the open world RPG. So, based on young Dan playing with Legos and creating his own stories, I'd have to think that in playing a game like, say, Skyrim, were you the one that would play the main storyline and figure out the story that was written by the game developers? Or did you just kind of immediately go off path and explore the world and kind of create your own story from there and just kind of eschew the main plot? I'm guessing
Oh,
you're
I'm a
more
side
the
quester
latter.
through and through.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's perfect though,
side
because
quester through and through, man. Yeah.
because that's that creative spark, right? Because then you can explore the world and enjoy the world and really have that escapism. But then you yourself are internalizing your own adventure, and I think that's a lot that people can get in fantasy. It's a very accessible thing to enjoy. I knew it. I'm the same way. I'm a side quester. So